Just to kind of, a couple things before we get started. 2 years ago, many years ago, a few years ago, probably more like many, I read an article by Gordon Fee, New Testament scholar, former teacher at Regent, and the name of the article was, "Why Pentecostals Read Their Bible Poorly." And of course, he is a member of our tribe, and I thought, okay, he's giving us the insider look. And he's saying there are two ways, not just Pentecostals, but Christians in general, read their Bible poorly. And part of what we do in the Sunday Bible class is to dig into the scriptures, but we're also trying to learn how do we read the Bible responsibly, okay? So one of the typical errors that people have is what he calls the temptation to iron. Now, anybody here love ironing? Anyone? Okay, I hate ironing, but anyway, I do it anyway. But you know what ironing is all about, okay? You take a piece of cloth and your desire is to make it all flat. And so you take the iron and you work it back and forth till all the wrinkles are gone, okay? And when it's applied to the scriptures, that is what happens when we take the scriptures and we say they all have to be interpreted the same way. Like, we do not pay attention to genre, we do not pay attention to whether it's history or poetry or apocalypse or prophecy. Everything's got to be the same. So we kind of iron it all the same. We try to get those difficult parts to understand, flatten them out so that we can, just treat it all the same. So sometimes people will make a big deal out of something that was supposed to be figurative. They treat it as literal. Like, there's lots of issues that come up from that whole issue of flattening it and trying to treat it all the same. But he said there's another error that big readers of the Bible sometimes fall into, and that is what I call missing the forest for the trees. Okay? And that is when you get so fixated on a verse or even a paragraph that you forget that there's stuff that goes before and there's stuff that comes after. Okay? And so as a result, you camp on that verse and you miss some of the nuances of it. Well, the reality is the Bible is more like a quilt than a sheet. It's multicolored and multi-textured, and you need to respect it for what it is. And the other thing is there's stuff in Genesis that informs what's going on in Revelation. Like, we have to read the scriptures in their context of their book, of their testament, of the entire Bible. And so just kind of keep that in mind. I may return to that, because that second error, to miss the forest as the trees, is something that we have done as a fellowship of churches, of which Broadway is a part, that we have done with this particular chapter of 1 Timothy. And I'll try, if I remember, I'll try to bring that to your attention. So, I've been enjoying this time with Timothy, and I've really come to see these letters in a new light as I've been studying them this time around. Just understanding where Paul was in his ministry at this point, in the final few years of his ministry. Just understanding Timothy, his road with Paul, and what's going on in Ephesus. And as I've tried to, and you can only do this imperfectly, kind of put myself in their shoes and understand, well, why would Paul write this? And what would Timothy be hearing? I've tried to reflect some of that in the teaching that he's been receiving. So let me just do a quick recap before we dive into this chapter. First visit of Paul to Ephesus is at the end of his third missionary journey in about 52 AD. Okay, just kind of keep that figure in mind, 52 AD. And then he moves on to Jerusalem eventually. And you remember in that first visit to Ephesus, he starts off in the synagogue until he runs into conflict with the Jewish leadership. And finally he moves next door to the Hall of Tyrannus, where he teaches effectively for 3 years, really impacting people from all over that region. Not just the city, but the region. And in fact, the gospel had such an impact that this city that was known for its worship of the pagan goddess Artemis, the silversmiths who made their money by selling religious artifacts for the worship of Artemis, so many people were getting saved and converting from the worship of Artemis to the worship of Jesus that it was cutting into their profits. And their protestations eventually caused a riot in Ephesus, as we read about in the book of Acts. So it's just, here's the impact of the gospel in a particular community, okay? And that's an exciting part to see. And so Paul leaves Ephesus, he heads off to Jerusalem, and carries on his journey and eventually ends up in Jerusalem. But on his way back to Jerusalem, he leaves Ephesus, let's say, in about, 53 AD, 54 AD, let's say. And of course, it's hard to be hard and fast. We don't have the dates. But on his way back, he stops by Miletus and calls the Ephesians leadership to him. So they come from Ephesus to Miletus. He's on his way to Jerusalem. He's just making a quick stop. And he warns them, be careful, there are going to be false teachers come among you. That's what he says to them. And of course, maybe he already saw the threads of the false teaching on his first visit, but he's reminding the eldership of the church in Ephesus that this is a danger, keep your radar on. And then he moves on to Jerusalem. And so that was probably about 57 AD, roughly, that he had that meeting with the Ephesian elders. I just want to give you some time frame. And then, of course, he is in house arrest in Rome. We read about that in Acts chapter 28, and that's probably like 60 to 62 AD. And most scholars are, the only way this makes sense is if he was released from that first Roman imprisonment and went on an undocumented fourth missionary journey. And Timothy and Paul end up back in Ephesus as a part of this journey, and they find that indeed what Paul has been fearing has come to pass. And there is a group of false teachers that are misrepresenting the gospel, threatening the unity of the church, damaging its witness in the area of Ephesus. And Paul decides this has got to be nipped in the bud, so he takes the first steps in disfellowshipping two of probably the ringleaders of this false teaching movement, Hymenaeus and Alexander. And then he moves on to Macedonia and says, Timothy, you need to finish up the job. We've started the process of dealing with this. I want you to finish the job. But as he carries on his missionary journey, he writes to Timothy to kind of coach him along in this process of restoring order to what had become a chaotic situation, to restore unity to what had become a divisive situation in the church, to bring the gospel to bear where false teaching was starting to creep in. And so Timothy is the one who is charged on Paul's behalf to work with that church in Ephesus to kind of bring things back and to restore the true worship of Jesus and the witness of the gospel so that the work of the kingdom could continue. And so he's very much concerned in 1 Timothy about behavior. He's not talking about doctrine here. He's talking about what do people who live Christ-centered lives, who have been touched and changed and shaped by the gospel, what do they act like? How do they behave? We certainly know how the false teachers are behaving, teaching speculative teachings about the Old Testament, and there are other things we'll discover that they were up to before we're finished this letter. But the reality is they are misrepresenting the gospel. What does it look like? What do people who represent the gospel look like? How do they behave? And so last week in chapter 2, we looked at, when the church gathers together for worship, what kind of behavior should we be expecting from the church when it gathers together in worship? And so in chapter 3, Paul is now turning his attention to helping Timothy identify the kinds of people who can provide faithful, godly leadership to the church. Because think about this. Okay, there's false teachers. Timothy's job is to shut down those false teachers, but there are still elements of the church that need to be cared for. And so he needs to replace the false teachers with new leadership. And what I think Paul is doing here, and again, this is what it looks like to me, I don't think Paul is writing to Timothy to say, here are the kind of people who are ruled out. Okay? You know what I'm saying? I'm giving you some definition of the kind of behaviors faithful leaders have so you can rule out everybody who doesn't qualify. I don't think that's what he's doing. I think what Paul is doing here is saying, here's the way that you rule people in. This is the kind of people you want to bring in. Okay? And so I think that's what he's trying to do in this letter. He's trying to help Timothy to say, as you look for new leadership, here's what you're looking for. This is the kind of people who will represent the gospel well. And so he's not so much giving a job description for church leadership, as this has often been interpreted, as he is describing the character of men and women who serve in leadership roles in the church. And I don't know if this list of characteristics is meant to be exhaustive. There's probably other things that we could come up with that we would think that would be equally valid. But he wants to paint a picture of mature Christian character, and he wants to identify those people whose faith has a tangible impact on their behavior, unlike Paul's opponents, the false teachers. And so he's setting out to clear up the confusion as to what kind of people can provide godly and effective leadership for the church in the service of the gospel. And again, keep in mind, there's some confusion in the church about this because we've got false teachers who claim to be believers who are trafficking among, the church in Ephesus. And so, Paul wants to make sure, as I put at the top of your outline, kind of going back to Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, by their fruit you will know them. Okay? And that's both true for false teachers and for godly leaders. So he's setting up to clear the confusion. Now, one of the essential skills of effective mentoring, if I can just take a bit of a discursus here, is the ability to pay attention to people and to discern what the Holy Spirit is doing in their lives. Great mentors see the potential resident in every life in whom the Holy Spirit dwells. And part of mentoring is intuitional, I get that, but mentoring also pays attention to what the behaviors of people are saying about their progress in the life of faith. And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount put it this way, with this piece of wisdom and warning: watch out for false prophets. Okay, it's something that they were dealing with throughout the early church. They come to you in sheep's clothing, right? They dress up like one of us, but inwardly they have ulterior motives. They're like ferocious wolves, and they don't spare anybody. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Are you following me? Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. And that, I think, is what Paul is trying to do for Timothy. He's saying, I want you to recognize the godly leadership that needs to be in charge of the church, and these are the kinds of people you want to bring in and replace the false teachers with. So Paul's observations here in the chapter echo Jesus' teaching. So what kind of fruit can we expect of godly leaders? Let's dig in. So if you've got your Bible, you want to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 3. And I'll just read the whole first 7 passages, and then I'll come back and start talking about some of the particulars. So here's how chapter 3 begins. Here is a trustworthy saying. Whoever aspires to be an overseer, I'll explain that in a minute, desires a noble task. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. And if anyone does not know how to manage his own family, he throws in an extra line: how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. Whoa. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, people who are not a part of the Christian community, so that he will not fall into disgrace in the devil's trap. Now keep in mind what Paul is trying to do here. He is saying we have got leaders who claim to be sheep, who are really wolves in sheep's clothing, who are exhibiting a kind of behavior that looks nothing like this. I want to make sure you understand what godly behavior from leaders looks like. And some of the things that he says here are in direct contradistinction to what's being happening among the false teachers, as we'll find out as we go along. So one of the first things that Paul wants to make clear to Timothy is those who aspire to leadership, number one, desire a good thing. They reflect a deep commitment to the ministry of the gospel and the work and the witness of the church. It's an important task. It's a task that has all kinds of responsibility. If someone's to be a leader in the church, somehow their life has to reflect what the gospel is all about. Leaders in the church need to model the gospel message, that there is a different way to be human, a different lifestyle that can be seen both in and beyond the church's walls. So Timothy, keep an eye open for these kinds of people, okay? The kind that I've just described. So, let's start with the character of overseers in verses 1 to 7. What is an overseer? Okay, it's not a term we often use. We've got all kinds of other words to describe people who have this function. But when you go into the New Testament and you look through the letters of Paul in particular, the terms overseer and elder and pastor or shepherd are all used in the New Testament to refer to the same office, the office of somebody who has responsibility for the church. And in Titus 1, 5 to 9, elder and overseer are used interchangeably. And I was talking to Andy the other day, and we thought it'd be a shame to camp on the pastoral letters and leave Titus out, so we will find room to include what's going in Titus's life as well. So an overseer, and from the New Testament, they use elder, pastor, overseer, somebody who has oversight of a congregation. You know, one of the house churches in the city of Ephesus in this particular case. In Acts chapter 20-28, Paul calls the Ephesian elders presbyteros. We get that word presbyters from that Greek word. And in Acts chapter 20-17, he talks about the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, episkopos, where we get the term bishop, to care for, paimano, to pastor, to serve as shepherds of the church of God. You see how he uses, conflates the language. And Peter also writes, I exhort the elders, i.e. presbyteros, among you, as a fellow elder, to shepherd, pomino actually, to pastor the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight. So I just share those scriptures to help you understand how overseer stresses the role of somebody who has responsibility to watch over or oversee a congregation, whether it's a house church or a larger gathering. So what are the kind of characteristics you're looking for in somebody who has desired to be a pastor or an overseer? Okay? And by the way, not a bad thing to aspire to leadership. Paul's saying it's a noble task, it's a big task, it's got a lot of responsibility attached to it. I don't want to discourage people from being overseers and pastors and shepherds. But there's some things you need to look for before you put these people in place and entrust them with leadership. So the first thing he says, and people look at this differently. I'm going to use what he says first to be kind of the envelope that I'll include all the other characteristics in. So the very first thing Paul says is, overseer should be above reproach. We don't tend to use that word as frequently today as I used to hear it, say, when I was growing up. But when we're talking about being above reproach, what are we talking about? Anyone? Above reproach. Who would you call as being, what kind of a person would you say is above reproach? Go ahead.
Someone who has integrity.
Okay.
Who is not doing things wrong.
Okay, somebody who has integrity, somebody who's not doing things wrong. Anyone else? This is good, you're moving in the right direction. Above reproach.
Can't pay him off.
Can't?
Can't pay him off, can't bribe
You
him.
can't bribe him, he can't be paid off, yeah, that's good.
Not political.
Not political.
So
Okay. Look around the room, Who would you say here is above reproach? No. Don't do that until I'm done. Okay, then you do look around. Above reproach heads this list of characteristics of an overseer. And it means to not be liable to criticism, not to have any skeletons in your closet, not to be saying one thing and living another thing. Anyone who fails to walk their talk will soon lose the trust and respect of people in the church, but not just in the church, as we'll find, also in the community. And people are always watching. And then this idea is unpacked by the words and phrases that follow in these next verses. I was working in the construction industry in Winnipeg at one time. Has anybody ever heard of Winnipeg? Little town out in the middle of the prairie. And it just so happened in Winnipeg at that time, there were different Christian tribes, if I can put it that way, who had people who would band together and start a construction company. And so as I trafficked among the different construction sites delivering material around, I would hear like some of the trades talk about the various construction companies. And I can remember in particular, in 2 or 3 different sites, people talking about one particular group, Christians, evangelicals, who were known to cut corners when it comes to the construction business. So these are people who are not necessarily believers, they're not necessarily churchgoers. They work for these people, they are waiting for their checks from these people, but they're saying, yeah, well, they talk big, they're all a part of this particular denomination, but when it comes to their business dealings, they're pretty shady. That's not being above reproach, okay? You want to have a good reputation in the church and beyond the church. So in that envelope of being above reproach, here are some of the other things that Paul adds to help us understand what are the characteristics of somebody who's an overseer, a pastor, an elder. The first thing he talks about is being the husband of one wife. Maias ginkikos andra. Very poor translation of the Greek. What that means has been widely debated. The Greek phrase is not common, and there are a few other instances where we can compare and kind of sort that out. The phrase literally states a one-woman man. I mean, essentially, that's what it says, literally. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright notes that Greek grammar sometimes refers to both genders together, and that early church leaders were predominantly men, and so it tended to use male language to describe leaders. And later on, Paul's going to direct his remark not just to male leaders, but to female leaders as well. But there's a couple of different ways to look at this verse. And this is where the POC may be complicit in maybe fragmenting the gospel to a certain degree. Isn't that terrible? That's it, my credentials are shot. Like, next week I will be disenfranchised. Let me explain. Many commentators understand the phrase to mean having the character of a one-woman man, that is, faithful to his wife. And in support of this view is the fact that a similar phrase is used in 1 Timothy 5:9 has a qualification for widows. Henos andros gyna, one man, woman, okay? The wife of one husband. And in that verse, it seems to refer to the trait of faithfulness. Paul is talking about monogamous relationships that are a model of marital faithfulness. Now, people who conclude that this is what Paul is saying here is saying that the requirement of marriage is not specific enough to be simply a reference to divorce and remarriage after divorce. In the context of this passage, the phrase, therefore, prohibits any kind of marital unfaithfulness. Okay? So it's basically saying, let's take the verse for what it says, but let's not read more into it than is actually there. Now, there is another view that says the view that husband of one wife means polygamous cannot be elders. Interpreters who hold this view notice that there is evidence of polygamy being practiced in some Jewish circles at the time. On this view, the phrase means at the present time, the husband of one wife. Okay, you see the nuances of how you could read this verse in line with the other qualifications that refer to present character. The third view is that Paul is absolutely requiring that an elder be someone who has never, ever in their entire life had more than one wife. Doesn't fit the context well with its emphasis on present character. So, why am I taking the fellowship of which I hold my credentials in dearly love and respect to task? When I first became a credential holder with the fellowship, anybody who was divorced and remarried could not hold membership, could not be a deacon or an elder, and could not be a pastor. We took a literal view of this particular point that says anybody who is divorced and remarried, whose previous spouse is still living, isn't eligible for any of these leadership roles. Okay? Now, over the years, as we've tried to bring in what Jesus says about marital unfaithfulness in Matthew, we have moderated our view. And so there is a list of qualifications that you need to go through if you're in the position of being divorced and remarried and have a previous spouse still living, and you aspire, a noble thing, to church leadership. What would need to happen to make that possible? And slowly but surely, for church membership, there was a little more latitude provided, and then for eldership, there's a little more latitude provided, and then for pastors now. Now, it's not just a free-for-all. Please understand, there are specific hoops to jump through when it comes to this business of, does a person own their part of the marital breakup? Has every effort at marital reconciliation been pursued? Has the former spouse remarried? There are several things but when I started, they took this literally one man forever, okay? Paul, am I on track with that? He's been around the fellowship for a while as well. That's kind of where we were. And we were just trying to be faithful to the scriptures, okay? It's not like, we were out and had a hate on for people who were remarried. It's just we were trying to be faithful to the scriptures as best we could. I think the first interpretation about marital faithfulness probably makes the most sense in the context of what Paul is saying here. That whoever aspires to church leadership, whatever the carnage of past relationships been before or after they came to faith, they need to be committed to the spouse that they are and demonstrably faithful to their current spouse. And so it's not a free-for-all. It's just saying we're looking for marital fidelity in our leaders, and this needs to be a quality that you're looking for. So in any of these views, Paul is speaking of ordinary cases, and he's not saying you can only be a deacon if you are married, or you can only be a deacon or an overseer if you have kids. It's not saying that either. Again, that's reading more into the passage than it's actually giving us. But it's giving us a picture of a typical approved overseer as a faithful husband and father able to teach, and God's intention from creation was for faithful, lifelong partnership between one man, one woman, right? That's what we get from Genesis. And that's what church leaders should be modeling. Well, then he talks about being temperate. Okay, now there's another word that we don't use. Has anybody ever been accused of being temperate? Temperate? Anyone? If I called you temperate, would you be offended or would you be encouraged? Okay. Okay. Now some of you are smart, right? It's in the Bible, so it's got to be good, right? What does temperate mean, as best as you understand it?
Good.
Okay. All right. We're usually talking about somebody who is sober-minded, not given to excess. Okay? Somebody that is not given to the wild swings of emotion. Somebody who is, in control of who they are. They're not given to excess. They are temperate. They're not hotheads. They're not, they live a balanced life. And then he goes on to talk about, okay, so let me just name this. One of the ways you become a temperate person is by exercising self-control. And again, not given to emotionalism and the behaviors that undisciplined feelings can produce. This is somebody who is, not kind of all over, everywhere, all at once. They have some discipline that they apply to their life as individuals and as followers of Jesus and in their family. They're not just out of control people. These are people who are disciplined. And then he says, also, overseers need to be respectable. Now, that's a word we do understand. And I'm not going to park on that for a long time. It's behaving in an honorable manner, worthy of respect. Okay? There are people in your life right now that you would say, this person is absolutely worthy of respect. I would trust them with my life. They have just been true blue, consistent. If you're looking for an example of what a godly person looks like, so-and-so. I just respect who they are. They're respectable. They're worthy of honor. And then hospitable. And this is a word, okay, there's a difference between the way we think of hospitable today and the way Paul was thinking of hospitable in his day. Okay. Now, when we think of somebody being hospitable, what are we talking about? Someone who's given to hospitality, they're hospitable.
Welcome into my house.
Okay. Were you born in the 1st century? No, just kidding, Bob. Okay. Somebody that you have over to your home, we call that hospitality when you invite somebody into your home. What else? Hospitable. Serving. Okay. Welcoming attitude. Okay. You're an all-star class. What can I tell you? You're way ahead of me, When Paul was talking about being hospitable, he was recognizing this reality. That in the day and age in which he was writing, people would travel, not on jets, but they would travel from community to community the way we do today. And often there were people, especially believers, who didn't want to stay at the public inn for safety reasons, and because I have no idea if the food here has been offered to idols or not. And so they would call upon other brothers and sisters in Christ in the new community. Could you take us in overnight or for a week or whatever? And when somebody invited a stranger into their home, that was considered hospitality. It was built into the Jewish way of thinking that you always showed hospitality to strangers. But really, literally, in this particular context, it is, loving strangers. Literally, it means, hospital means loving strangers, trying to make it easy for people to feel at home. And in this context, again, Christian traveling would avoid inns and look for a Christian home in which to stay, and hospitality is the willingness, as Bob says, to share one's home with others. Able to teach. This is an ability that is born of prayerful meditation on the Scriptures, whose truth is, number one, personally lived out in the overseer's life, which provides the credibility and spiritual authority to instruct others. One of the things that you often hear in the Gospels, as Jesus is preaching and teaching, is people say, whoa, this guy speaks like authority. Not like the other religious leaders. This guy's cut from a different cloth. He talks as if he knows what's really going on here. He's talking to somebody who's got authority. Okay? Partly of that is the anointing of the Holy Spirit, but part of that is just being a student of the Scriptures, working with them, letting them form your life, being able to live them out, and then being able to share with others out of what you've learned. Here's how the Bible has changed my life. Here's how it's truth. Here's how the gospel has shaped me. Here is how it can shape you. Here's where in the Scriptures it guides us in that direction. And of course you see Paul, looking into the Old Testament Scriptures to, make his points many places. Jesus draws from the Old Testament Scriptures to, teach authoritatively. And so, for somebody who's going to be in the office of a pastor, they need to be conversant in the Word, like, diligent to show themselves approved unto God, rightly handling the word of truth. That's kind of where he's going with this, able to teach. Number 7, not given to much wine means not addicted to drink and being drunk or rowdy. Usually drunkenness and alcohol excess is just a typical example of immaturity. And reflects other issues in a person's life. He said that's just not the reputation we want pastors to have. So, in our fellowship, we all agree to abstain from alcohol altogether, and that's just our way of trying to avoid every appearance of evil. We don't want to be seen as, those drunken sots, okay? It's just not a good reputation to have. But he said this is usually going to embarrass you rather than commend you, and so he said, you just got to find somebody who is not taken over by being addicted to drink or drunkenness. Not violent but gentle. Not giving to brawling or physical abuse on the one hand, and exercising gentleness or kindness in the face of antagonism and anger. And this is what the false teachers were not doing. They were majoring in contention and combativeness. And, you know, they had people who they included and people they didn't include. They were, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? I was going to say pugilistic. What's the other word I was thinking of? They're combative. And he said that's not what a godly leader looks like. Always looking to pick a fight. Always trying to prove they're right. Always kind of run over other people, okay? And press their point. That doesn't mean that they do not study to show themselves approved unto God, but when they present the truth, they don't do it in a forceful or overhanded way. They do it in a gentle and sensitive way. So they're not getting to brawling and physical abuse, exercising gentleness and kindness. And then, of course, the second one picks up on that. Not quarrelsome, not contentious or combative. It's very interesting to me in all the years that I've been involved in ministry that I hear a lot of sermons on how to interact with people who are yet to come to faith in Jesus. And some of the things that I've seen have given me pause. Like, I just thought, boy, this is not me. And I very rarely hear that passage preached that the Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, in gentleness correcting those who are in opposition. And I thought, especially over these last 2 or 3 years, yeah, we should have preached a little more on that verse just to make sure we understand what does godly interactions with the outside world look like, okay? And so he says somebody who is qualified for leadership doesn't show this notion that they're always trying to pick fights, they're always quarrelsome. By the way, I have had brothers and sisters along the way who have been a little more combative than they have been, you know, conciliatory, and especially on things that they care passionately about. Number 10, not a lover of money. Now, and again, Paul is not sitting here saying money is bad. What he's saying is people who the love of money causes them to compromise their Christian witness. He's going to accuse the false teachers in Ephesus of doing this very thing, preaching the gospel for gain. Okay? So, not a lover of money means they can't be swayed by making a buck on a dishonest way. No one given to greed is really qualified to serve in leadership in the church and provide a good godly example. And then, of course, it talks about managing his own household well. And it's highlighted as a qualification for eldership by the greater amount of discussion given to it. And of course, I think the principle behind this is that the home is the proving ground of Christian character, and then it's the preparation for the field of ministry. Somebody who is a godly man or woman who is faithful in their own home and is a great parent and father and mother. When you see that taking place, you're thinking that's the kind of person, if they can be a good manager at home, they can be a good manager anywhere, you know. And so an overseer's home should be characterized by the earned respect and obedience of one's children. Now I realize, trust me, I realize, women have their own, children have their own minds as well. And I can't always control the decisions my children make. But we do emphasize in the family respect and you know, caring for one another and respecting one another. It's all a part of managing your household well. It doesn't mean everything's perfect, but it means that, you know, there is the application of, you know, grace and gentleness. And oh, by the way, he goes on to say, you know, there's a way you do this, you know. Earning that respect, yes, having your children obey, but having earned that respect. And so those two things go together. Leadership in the home comes with earning respect, okay? And those things are, when you see that happening in somebody's home, that's the kind of people for leadership you're looking for, somebody like that, okay? Not a recent convert, not somebody who is not well grounded in the faith or godly character, because they're susceptible to pride and letting the power of leadership go to their head. Yep, I've experienced that as well. No matter what the level of giftedness, time is needed to demonstrate Christian maturity and faithfulness. You need a track record before you elevate somebody to a position of leadership. There's a real spiritual consequence to letting pride run away with you. And the devil is a case in point. Prideful people are walking in his footsteps, and I notice that Paul drops that in, you know. People who are caught up in pride sort of reflect the devil, who that was his downfall as well. Okay. Have a good reputation with outsiders. The concern for the opinion of outsiders matters. there is a concern throughout this letter, in fact, throughout the New Testament, about how the church and therefore the gospel is portrayed to a watching world. The overseer with a bad reputation often brings irreparable damage to the witness of the church and the cause of Jesus Christ. Now, it seems sad, I suppose, that Paul has set out what should be obvious about godly leaders, but clearly the false elders in the Ephesian church, who claimed to be followers of Jesus, but were not walking their talk, were causing confusion and disgrace to the ministry of the gospel, and so Paul was setting about to redress that problem. So leaders in the church must embody and represent the message they are called to proclaim. But Paul has more to say about church leadership, and I'm going to go through this next section pretty quickly, because in these next two categories of leaders, Paul says, in the same way. In the same way, in the same way. So a lot of what applies to overseers also applies to what we're calling deacons. And the simplest way to understand a deacon is, if the pastor has spiritual authority and responsibility in the church, deacon, New Testament, it's a servant. Deacon means servant, deaconos. Is somebody who looks after the practical or the material needs of the church. And that's kind of how we organize our own church government to some degree. So in the same way, he goes along, he expresses several different things that are just similar to the overseers, so I'm not going to go over them. But I do need to stop and just talk briefly about chapter 11. Chapter 11 has been the cause of much debate in the church. Okay? So you go through the deacons. You know, the fact that you're not a pastor doesn't mean you're not called to godly leadership and the attributes that qualify. And I've kind of listed them all there for you. And you'll see lots of them are same as for overseers with a few additions. In the same way, verse 11 says, women are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. The problem in this verse, and it comes to understanding what Paul is getting at, is why is this verse here? And the word gyne is plural here, and it can equally mean, it depends on the context, it could mean women, or it could mean wives. Okay? And that ambiguity results in these three interpretations. That what he's talking about in verse 11 is, number one, are the wives of deacons. Okay, they're wives. That's how the ESV, which is my favorite version, translates it. The only problem with deacons and their wives is that the there isn't there. Okay. The NIV, the Message, the NRSV, the NASB all say women. In the same way, women are to be trustworthy of respect and not malicious talkers, but temperate or trustworthy in everything. And then he's going to go back and talk about same thing as for overseers, managing your household. And so I'm sitting there thinking, Paul, what's with this little discursus? Where does this come from? That all of a sudden we're talking about, it seems like, another category of leadership in the church. It's like you're thinking, okay, and I'm talking about deacons, and oh yeah, there's other women also leading. At least, I'm trying to figure out, one day when we get to heaven, there will be a long line outside of Paul's mansion of people waiting to ask him, Paul, what did you mean when? Okay, and I will be in that line. Okay. So it could be wives of deacons. It could be women who are deacons, similar to Phoebe in Romans chapter 16:1. She's referred to as a deacon or deaconess, if you prefer. Or women who assist deacons in some way. So, you know, there is some room for debate on what he's getting at here. They sort of appear abruptly in the flow of the text. The reference to wives of deacons makes sense to some, but why is it just dropped in here in the middle of nowhere? You know, how come deacons' wives have to shape up and overseers' wives can live just any way they want? Okay? Nothing is said about overseers' wives, but all of a sudden now we're talking about deacons' wives, and I'm thinking, okay, what's going on here? We know that there was women who had leadership roles, both serving in the early church. And so, you know, however you decide to land on this verse, I'm going to give you charity on this one. Okay? But I'm pretty sure it says, and the women. Not their wives, but and the women. Talking about all the women in the church who are serving an area of leadership. And here are the things that they need to have in their envelope. This is what it means to be above reproach if you're a woman in leadership. Number one, worthy of respect. We've heard that before. Same as overseers and deacons. Not malicious talkers. Not slanderers or false accusers, some versions we'll say, who harm others through gossip and innuendo. Temperate, same as overseers and not being contentious. And trustworthy. What does it mean to be trustworthy? Really, just in a nutshell. Let's just make it really, really simple. To be trustworthy is what? Anyone?
Honest.
Honest?
Keep your word.
You keep your word. Your yes is yes, your no is no. You don't play games. You don't fudge the truth. Just you're true blue, okay? And so he says this is one of the attributes of women in leadership, is that they're trustworthy. They do what they say, and they say what they do. They're trustworthy. And so Paul highlights the value and importance of deacons by stating two results. People who are in leadership, that aspire to it, and have these characters, they have good standing within the church, they have respect, and they're respected, and they have great assurance or confidence in the gospel. It's an ability to impact their lives and the lives of people that they are ministering to. And so he wraps it up with this marvelous poem at the end, and we're running out of time, so I appreciate that. But he says, "Though I hope to come to you soon," this is verse 14, "I'm writing to you these instructions, that if I'm delayed, you know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household." Okay, do you get the point? That is this whole point for this whole chapter. If I'm delayed, I want you to know, Timothy, how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household. That's what chapter 2 is about. That's what chapter 3 is about. Which is the church of the living God and the pillar of the foundation of truth. Beyond all question, the mystery which comes through true godliness springs is great. And then he gives a little poem that is the gospel in a nutshell. And so in this last part, he talks about intention, he talks about instruction, and then he talks about adoration with that poem. And that's how he wraps up that particular chapter. Mentoring, our mentoring practice, paying attention. Paul coaches in this chapter, Timothy, this is what you need to look for. Godly men and women who walk their talk, who are trustworthy to be leaders among God's people. Find them, encourage them, enlist them, equip them. That's what mentors do. 1 Timothy 3 describes what to look for, but how do we activate godly leaders? Well, you need to pay attention. You need to get to know people. You need to see the fingerprints at God on the lives of the people to whom you are encouraging. Listening, being open to the Spirit is critical. Asking good questions, communicating interest and care is critical. And prayer, asking God for discernment so that you can see what's going on, what the Holy Spirit is up to in that particular person's life. And over time, mentors develop an eye for potential and the ability to help a person discern and respond to God's calling in their lives. And so you see, this is what Paul's doing for Timothy. He's mentoring, he's coaching him along. He's saying, I trust you, I'm confident you can do this. Here's what you need to be looking for. Here's what you need to turn your radar on for. Look for these kinds of people and elevate them, encourage them, equip them to be leaders.